Joining me now, delighted as well, is Stephen Kinnock MP, Shadow Minister for Immigration on TalkTV Breakfast. Stephen, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Jeremy. Very well, thank you.
Did you watch that interview last night?
I didn't, unfortunately. I was actually speaking at a Labour Party event, so I missed it, but I've seen the stuff on social media around it.
I mean, he seems, Sunak, to say, and I'm not taking sides at all, he says that he now has a tough stance on immigration, that he wants to send migrants back to their countries, that he's been talking to Albania. The Rwanda thing still can happen. Again, in layman's terms, Stephen, the British public, this is... And we couldn't have talked about this 5 years ago because people would have said it's wrong to talk like this. The British public are so fed up, they want somebody to stick their head above the parapet and say, this needs to be done. What's Labour's answer to the immigration? How would Labour stop those small boats?
We'd do the hard yards, Jeremy. Rather than chasing headlines in tabloid newspapers, we'd actually get on with the nitty-gritty work of clearing the backlog, first and foremost. So back in 2013, the Conservative government decided to downgrade the seniority of the people working in the Home Office on asylum cases, so-called caseworkers and decision makers. And as a result of that, we've ended up with people with less experience and expertise making decisions which were then more open to appeal. And that has increased the clogging up of the backlog. Then on top of that, they failed to get a successor to the Dublin Convention, which was what enabled us to return failed asylum seekers to safe countries or to country of origin. And on top of that, they've got this unworkable and unaffordable and unethical Rwanda scheme, which has also absorbed a huge amount of time and money and is simply not working. So rather than chasing headlines and doing government by gimmick, Labour would be actually getting in to the Home Office, fixing the issues, clearing the backlog, and actually in the end saving the taxpayer a lot of money, because we've got 37,000 asylum seekers in hotels at the moment, costing the taxpayer £4.7 million a day. It's
and they're in, Stephen. And look, it's you talk about headlines, and you're right. So many prime ministers and Home Office officials over the last however many years have said that they're going to deal with this. For people watching and listening to this morning, as I tried to say to Stephen Wolfe, who was very interesting earlier, he said, and I'd love your opinion on this, that a government can have a policy, but there is definitive proof that there's a certain elitist sort of group of people in civil servants, in not opposition parties, but all over the place, that make it very easy for government policy to be pushed back on, rowed back on. I don't understand, in political terms, if I was the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak this morning, and I would have done it a year ago, I woke up, I would know that this is an absolute must for British people who are struggling their backsides off, those terrible stories of British Gas, people can't pay their bills, all of these things going on. And whereas, as you know, this is true, 5 or 10 years ago, you'd have been called racist if you mentioned immigration, but people are fed up, and we get bunged up into this whole argument of, you know, these people are escaping war-torn countries. Yes, underlined, there are people who we will show safe haven to, and we should, and we did during the Ukraine crisis, but there are an increasing number of people coming here illegally, and it's not just the traffickers, it's the impact on the British people. And I don't understand, and you said it, why somebody doesn't stand up and say, I'm going to do this today, that tomorrow, and that by Friday, because it's going to make a difference. Are they scared? What? Why doesn't somebody act more decisively, Stephen?
There's a fundamental issue for this government, which is around the breakdown in our relationship with the European Union. I mean, the reality is that the vast majority of people that come on small boats, well, all of them, in fact, have come across Europe. They find themselves in France. If you're going to deal with that issue, we can't do it in isolation. It's not an isolated British...
So are Europe, I'll put the question to you I put to Stephen Wolfe, are Europe being deliberately awkward and paying us back for Brexit and leaving the EU? Would this immigration problem have been better if we hadn't left in the referendum 3 years ago?
I don't think we're looking at that. What we're looking at is the bungled nature of the way that Brexit has been handled, and the fact that the successive Conservative governments since 2016 have just been burning the relationship, burning the bridges, and failing to have a proper grown-up conversation with the European Union. And let's not forget, in her leadership campaign, Liz Truss wasn't even able to say whether or not Emmanuel Macron is a friend or a foe. And this is at a time where Vladimir Putin is invading Ukraine, and we need to stand together with our European partners and allies. So, nothing that the government has done has helped to get that partnership in place, which is both a security partnership around cracking down on the people smugglers and dealing with that at source. So we would scrap the Rwanda plan and repurpose all the money that's being wasted on that into an elite unit in the National Crime Agency. 100 new specialists surged into the NCA to go after the people smugglers, and we would do a deal with the European Union, which enabled us to do returns, but where of course we understand, that the UK has to stand up and do its bit as well. But if we could get that strategy in place, which enabled us to do the returns, that would of course help us to clear the backlog. And let's not forget that the backlog itself is a magnet, because there are many people who, if you knew that if you paid £5,000 to a people smuggler, but as soon as you landed in the UK, you were going to be returned to the first safe country that you came from, you wouldn't pay that £5,000, and you would break the people smugglers model overnight. But for that to happen, we have to have a deal with the European Union, which involves them taking people back. But of course, we need to be taking our fair share of people who are applying for asylum in this country, and that's about having a proper relationship as well with the United Nations.
Let me throw at you. I know what you'll say, and try not to give me the look until I get the question out, because my viewers and listeners would expect me to ask it. You talk about how one of Labour's ideas would be to have not bungled conversations but dialect with Europe, and you just said making a deal with the European Union. We are less than 2 years from a general election, Stephen Kinnock, and you know as well as I do that there are swathes of people in this country who are dissatisfied, quite rightly, I think, with a failing Tory government, who still believe, whether you like this or not, that the Labour Party will go against the public wishes and begin to integrate us back into the EU. Now, whether you are pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit, whatever, that was a referendum, it's done. Is this an example of how Labour would start to get back into bed with the EU?
No, look, I mean, I don't think that there's an appetite for rejoining the EU anywhere. I mean, a lot of people are very dissatisfied with the totally botched way in which Brexit has been handled. But there's a big difference between that and saying we want to go back into having a discussion about rejoining the EU. And by the way, I think the EU looks at the catastrophic and chaotic nature of British politics over the last few years and says, no thanks. We don't want to start getting into a hokey-cokey relationship with the United Kingdom either. So it's much more about having grown-up conversations, dealing with the issues that we can deal with, like a returns agreement, but also like a veterinary agreement, like mutual recognition of conformity assessments, mutual recognition of professional qualifications. All of that can be done without us going back into the single market or the customs union or indeed the European Union. So it's about common sense, pragmatism, rather than chasing headlines and trying to do government by gimmick.
Do you believe that this immigration issue will be central to the next election?
I think it will be very important to people. I think there's a lot of other very important issues out there, like the cost of living crisis, like the massive impact we're seeing today of interest rates going up again, like the appalling fact that we've got 7.2 million people on our NHS waiting list. So I think there'll be a number of very important issues, but this will definitely be up there, because the first duty of any government is to secure our borders. And of course, we were told that Brexit was about taking back control. But when you see what's happening in terms of the small boats crisis, that isn't what it looks like to a lot of people. So these issues need to be resolved. When we get into government, we're going to have a big mess to clear up, Jeremy.
You say you'll get in. We'll see about that. Stephen Kinnock, always a pleasure, never a chore. Stephen Kinnock MP, Shadow Minister for Immigration.